In recent videos on this channel, I briefly mentioned Hermes and Hermeticism. They're terms that often appear in ancient texts, esoteric circles, and philosophical discussions. But the truth is, even though they're so important, very few people actually know what these words mean. Maybe you associate Hermeticism with magic, occultism, or with the Greek god Hermes. Maybe you've heard the name Hermes Trismegistus, but you're not exactly sure who he was, or why he's considered one of the most mysterious spiritual figures in human history. So today, we're going to uncover what Hermeticism truly is, and why it has shaped religions, philosophies, and secret societies for over 2,000 years. This video isn't here to skim the surface, it's not a lecture, and it's definitely not about fantastical theories that disconnect you from reality. This is a deep dive into a tradition that has spanned centuries, and yet never disappeared. And if it survived this long, it's because it still has something to reveal. Hermeticism is a system of thought that has been recognized by scholars for centuries, with written records that cross cultures, religions, and historical eras. Its texts appear in the archives of Hellenistic Egypt, in the manuscripts of Alexandria, and in the writings of Neoplatonic philosophers like Iamblichus and Proclus. And later, in Arabic translations that connect Hermes to the prophet Idris, the biblical Enoch, which helped preserve Hermetic teachings in Islamic scholarship and Sufi circles. It was read by early church fathers such as Clement of Alexandria, and later rediscovered during the European Renaissance by figures like Marsilio Ficino, who translated the Corpus Hermeticum into Latin, believing he had found the oldest wisdom known to humanity. It's no exaggeration to say that Hermeticism influenced the birth of science, alchemy, astrology, and even Western philosophy itself. This knowledge survived millennia, adapting to the layers and language of each age, but its essence has remained intact. But if this knowledge is so important, why do so few people today know what Hermeticism even is? To understand that, we have to return to its origin, not just in geography, but in symbolism. Imagine a world where religion and science were not yet separated, where wisdom wasn't divided into disciplines, but understood as a single living body of knowledge. It's in this world, between the sands of Egypt and the philosophical halls of Greece, that Hermeticism begins to take shape. We're talking about the Hellenistic period, after the conquests of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE. Egypt, now under Greek rule, became a cultural melting pot, a meeting point between the spiritual depth of the Egyptians and the philosophical reasoning of the Greeks. The fusion of these worlds didn't happen only through ideas, but also through their deities. The Greeks looked at the Egyptian god Thoth, lord of wisdom, patron of writing, and mediator between gods, and saw striking similarities with their own celestial messenger, Hermes. Thoth, with the head of an ibis, was the one who wrote the Book of the Dead, presided over the judgment of souls, and held the secrets of the unseen world. Hermes, with his winged sandals, was the guide of souls, the god of language, and the master of the spiritual alchemy of the Logos. From the fusion of these two divine figures emerged a new entity, Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great. Great in wisdom, great in occult power, great in divine revelation. But Hermes Trismegistus wasn't seen only as a god. He was also portrayed as an ancient sage, a human figure believed to have lived among us millennia ago, a master who ascended to divine status through sacred knowledge. According to tradition, Hermes was the first initiate, the first to write about the mysteries of creation, the soul, and the cosmos. Some believed he was the teacher of Moses. Others saw him as the forerunner of Pythagoras, Plato, or even the biblical prophets. And this symbol, half man, half divine, took on different names and forms across cultures. For the Greeks, he was Hermes. For the Egyptians, Thoth. For the Romans, he became Mercury, god of transitions, commerce, and secrets. For Hellenized Jews, he was identified with Enoch, the patriarch who ascended to heaven without tasting death. For Muslims, he is Idris, the prophet who brought writing and esoteric wisdom, and who also ascended to the heavens while still alive. In each tradition, the same essence. Hermes is the messenger between worlds, the one who reveals the invisible, the one who translates divine language into human words. Hermeticism, then, didn't begin as a formal religion, but as a symbolic lineage, a stream of wisdom flowing across cultures and times, always carrying the same mission, to awaken in the human being the memory of the divine. From this legacy came the writings that form the heart of Hermeticism, the Hermetica. These texts were composed between the 2nd century BCE and the 4th century CE, mainly in the city of Alexandria, the greatest intellectual center of the ancient world. And although they were written at different times, in different languages and styles, they all carry the same core idea, that the human being is a reflection of the divine, and that through knowledge, not just rational but spiritual, we can awaken the divine spark hidden within us. Thus, Hermeticism emerges not as a dogmatic religion, but as a path of reconnection, an esoteric way that bridges heaven and earth, mind and spirit. And it's from this symbolic and historical origin that the tradition begins to spread. But to understand how it survived for so long, we need to go back to its central figure. Because if Hermes was just a myth, why are there ancient records that insist on treating him as real? The figure of Hermes Trismegistus wasn't just accepted as a philosophical symbol. He was recorded by ancient authors as a legitimate part of humanity's spiritual history. One notable example is the Jewish historian Artapanus of Alexandria, who lived in the 2nd century BCE. He identified Hermes with Moses himself, suggesting that the two represented the same divine source of revelation, but named differently by different cultures. To Artapanus, Hermes wasn't an allegorical invention, but a real figure tied to the origin of revealed wisdom. This idea also appears in the writings of Manetho, an Egyptian priest from the same era, who claimed there had been multiple Hermes figures throughout history. In his view, Hermes was not a single person, but a title, a role passed down to exceptional sages who emerged in different ages of illumination, not a name, but a function, a link between worlds. These interpretations weren't random. The ancient writers were surrounded by oral traditions, fragmented sacred texts, and remnants of knowledge that felt much older than the historical records could date. By connecting Hermes to figures like Moses, they were trying to trace the roots of sacred knowledge, and they recognized in Hermes a common point of origin. This recognition of Hermes as a legitimate, though mysterious, figure is what allowed his writings to keep circulating, being studied and preserved through the centuries. And whether Hermes was a real figure or not, what truly matters is that at some point in history, a significant body of texts emerged, all attributed to him. But over time, these texts passed through different hands, cultures, and interpretations. That's why they don't all say the same thing. In fact, they're quite different from each other. Because of these differences, over time scholars began dividing Hermetic writings into two main categories: technical texts and philosophical texts. The technical texts focus on esoteric practices such as astrology, alchemy, sacred medicine, and magical rituals. They were aimed at manipulating natural forces and applying occult knowledge in practical ways. The philosophical texts, on the other hand, explore topics such as the nature of the mind, the structure of the cosmos, the origin of the soul, and the path back to the divine. Though their approaches differ, both groups are rooted in the same core idea. Reality is made up of interconnected planes, and the human being, as a microcosm, has access to all of them. This modern classification helps us understand the variety of styles and purposes within Hermeticism. While the technical texts offer tools to interact with the world, the philosophical ones guide consciousness beyond it. It's in the interplay between practice and contemplation that Hermeticism reveals itself, as a system of knowledge that unites action and transcendence, rather than separating. When you start reading the Hermetic texts, something might confuse you right away. In one passage, the material world is described as divine, harmonious, sacred. In another, it's portrayed as a prison, an illusion, something the soul must leave behind. How can both be true? In some treatises, life, the body, and the act of creating children are seen as natural parts of the divine plan. In others, the body is a burden, matter, a distraction. But this contradiction isn't a mistake. It's intentional and strategic. The texts weren't written for a single type of person. They speak to different levels of consciousness. For those just starting out, the teachings point toward the world, toward ethics, toward the beauty of what is seen. For those further along the path, they point inward, toward silence, toward detachment. Hermeticism doesn't offer one fixed answer. It offers layers, and that's why the more you evolve, the more the texts seem to change. But in truth, it's you who's reading from a different place. And this is precisely where Hermeticism sets itself apart from other traditions. It wasn't meant to be merely read, it was meant to be lived. The philosophical texts, especially those in the Corpus Hermeticum, don't follow the structure of sermons or doctrines. They're written as dialogues, Most of them depict a master, usually Hermes, teaching a disciple. It's a conversation, a transmission of consciousness. And that already reveals something important about the spirit of the tradition. Hermeticism is built on the idea that truth cannot simply be told, it must be perceived. That's why the teachings are delivered in layers, through experience, introspection, and the silence between the words. The ultimate goal? Gnosis. And we're not talking about intellectual knowledge. Gnosis is a direct, experiential knowing. It's not something you learn, it's something you awaken. A living understanding of your own spiritual nature, and of the divine structure of reality. And that awakening doesn't happen instantly. It requires guidance, preparation, and inner purification. That's why many scholars believe the Hermetic texts were part of an initiatory process, a gradual path where the disciple was guided by a mentor, and each text marked a stage of progression, from the most grounded foundations to the highest levels of mind and spirit. In this sense, Hermeticism isn't a collection of ideas. It's a journey, a symbolic map for those who seek to pierce the veils of appearance and touch, if only for a moment, what is real. But what exactly do these texts say about the reality they try to reveal? Part of the philosophical value of Hermeticism lies in the way it describes reality. In the authentic texts of the Corpus Hermeticum, we find ideas that deeply influenced the Western esoteric tradition. One of the central points is the nature of the divine. One passage states, "God is everything that exists, and what is not visible he holds within himself." This perspective reflects the idea that the divine is not separate from the world, but is the very structure of existence itself. We also find the notion that everything in the universe is connected in constant motion and interdependence. Modern scholar Garth Fowden, a key reference in Hermetic studies, sums it up like this: everything is part of God, and God is in everything. His creative activity never ceases. All things are one, and the fullness of being is indestructible. This interpretation isn't just symbolic, it's structural. Hermeticism begins with the premise that behind the diversity of forms, there is a final unity, a singular source from which everything arises. To know this unity, according to the texts, is the true aim of philosophy. This kind of assertion is why Hermeticism is not just a historical curiosity. It offers an entire way of seeing the world, where reason, nature, and divinity are part of a single field of understanding. Over the centuries, Hermeticism was reinterpreted by various cultures. During the Renaissance in Florence, the Corpus Hermeticum was translated into Latin by Marsilio Ficino, at the request of Cosimo de' Medici, even before the works of Plato were translated. At the time, it was believed that Hermes' writings predated the Bible, which elevated them to the status of a lost link to primordial wisdom. That belief made Hermeticism a crucial reference for alchemists, natural philosophers, and Renaissance theologians. Traces of its influence can be found in the works of Giordano Bruno, Cornelius Agrippa, and even in the thought of early figures in modern science. Outside the Christian world, Hermetic texts circulated in Arabic translations and indirect commentaries, especially within esoteric and medical traditions. The figure of Hermes, tied to the transmission of ancient knowledge, was embraced across many traditions in both East and West. In these contexts, he remained a symbol of spiritual authority, nearly always linked to occultism, astrology, and alchemy. More than a name, Hermes represented a convergence point between religious, philosophical, and initiatic systems, which is what allowed his teachings to remain accessible even through periods of intense cultural and political change. And despite so many different interpretations, one thing remains. He never settled into a single form. What we've seen so far makes it clear that Hermeticism was never an organized movement, nor a structured school with clearly identified disciples. It survived because of the texts, and the texts survived because of the ideas they carried. Ideas that crossed empires, religions, languages, and centuries, and that continued to be read, studied, and applied by people from completely different backgrounds and with wildly different intentions. Hermeticism didn't stay alive because it imposed truths, but because it offered pathways. It influenced alchemists, philosophers, astronomers, and mystics, but also silent readers who found in its pages something other systems didn't offer, a way to integrate rational inquiry with inner experience. In the end, Hermeticism can't be defined by a set of rules. It's defined by the attitude it proposes. Observe, reflect, understand, and from that understanding, transform. What began as a series of treatises attributed to a symbolic figure became one of the hidden pillars of Western culture. And it's precisely because it never locked itself into a single form that it continues to be rediscovered, because every time someone studies it with sincerity, it changes. And with it, the one who studies changes too. If you don't see Hermeticism as mere entertainment, but as a true path of initiation, know this channel exists for you. Subscribe and turn on the bell. It helps me keep bringing you content that supports and strengthens your journey of inner transformation.